When 22-year-old Sophia Chen looked up from her aviation textbook in Seat 2A of Transatlantic Flight 447 and saw both pilots collapsed in the cockpit through the open cabin door, she had no idea that the next 2 hours would transform her from a failed pilot trainee carrying the weight of her family's shattered dreams into the only person capable of saving 180 souls hurtling through a thunderstorm over the Atlantic Ocean at 35,000 feet. This is the story of a girl who everyone said wasn't good enough to fly, whose fear of failure had grounded her dreams, but whose knowledge of aircraft systems and desperate courage would prove to be the difference between a routine flight to London and one of the most miraculous emergency landings in aviation history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Boeing 777-300ER had been cruising smoothly through the night sky for 3 hours when Sophia first noticed something was wrong. She had been reviewing approach procedures for her upcoming re-examination at flight school, the same test she had failed twice before due to what her instructors called decision paralysis under pressure. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was flying first class on her parents' money to London, where she planned to tell them in person that she was abandoning her dream of becoming a commercial pilot to pursue something safer, something that wouldn't disappoint them again. The first sign of trouble had been subtle, a change in the aircraft's attitude that made her look up from her advanced flight systems manual. As the daughter of aeronautical engineers and a former aerospace student herself, Sophia could feel things that ordinary passengers missed: the slight vibration in the wing structure, the barely perceptible shift in engine tone, the way the cabin pressure seemed to fluctuate just outside the normal range. Captain Michael Rodriguez had been flying for Transatlantic Airways for 15 years with over 12,000 hours of flight time and an impeccable safety record. First Officer Lisa Park was one of the airline's rising stars, known for her technical precision and calm demeanor under pressure. Neither of them should have been affected by what appeared to be a routine flight through scattered thunderstorms over the North Atlantic. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But as Sophia watched through the partially open cockpit door, both pilots began exhibiting signs of distress that sent ice through her veins. Captain Rodriguez was slumped over his controls while First Officer Park seemed to be struggling to maintain consciousness, her hands shaking as she reached for the radio microphone. The cabin crew was busy with dinner service, and most of the 178 passengers were either sleeping or absorbed in their entertainment systems. No one else seemed to notice that Flight 447 was beginning to deviate from its assigned flight path, or that the autopilot system was generating soft warning tones that only someone with aviation training would recognize as the beginning of a potentially catastrophic situation. Sophia's mind raced through the possibilities: food poisoning affecting the flight crew, carbon monoxide leak in the cockpit, sudden medical emergency, or something far worse. Her failed attempts at flight certification had taught her one valuable lesson: in an emergency, hesitation kills. Despite her history of freezing under pressure during examinations, something about the reality of the situation cut through her usual paralysis with crystalline clarity. She unbuckled her seatbelt and moved toward the front of the aircraft, her heart pounding but her hands steady for the first time since she had started flight training 2 years earlier. The lead flight attendant, Maria Santos, was coming out of the galley with a service cart when Sophia intercepted her. "There's something wrong with the pilots," Sophia said quietly, not wanting to panic the other passengers. "I have flight training. We need to check on them immediately." Maria's professional smile faltered as she followed Sophia's gaze toward the cockpit, where Captain Rodriguez was now completely unconscious and First Officer Park was barely maintaining her grip on consciousness. The flight attendant's face went pale as she realized the implications of what they were seeing. "Oh God," Maria whispered, "are you qualified too?" "I'm not certified yet," Sophia admitted, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her system. "But I know these aircraft systems, and right now I might be the only person on this plane who has any chance of getting us safely on the ground." Through the cockpit windows, she could see the storm clouds building ahead of them, their tops reaching well above the aircraft's current altitude. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the weather radar was painting an ominous picture of severe turbulence and possible wind shear conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. Flight 447 was now completely off course, flying through increasingly dangerous weather with no conscious crew members to guide it. The autopilot was still engaged, but Sophia knew that automated systems were only as good as the humans who programmed them, and they couldn't make the complex decisions that would be required to navigate through the storm safely. As she stepped into the cockpit for the first time as anything other than an observer, Sophia felt the weight of 180 lives settling on her shoulders. Every passenger on the aircraft was now depending on someone who had never successfully completed a solo flight, who had failed her certification exam twice, and who was about to attempt something that even experienced pilots would consider nearly impossible. But as her hands touched the controls of the massive aircraft and she felt the subtle feedback from the flight systems, something clicked into place that had never happened during her training flights. The fear was still there, but it was manageable now, focused into determination rather than paralyzing her with indecision. "Maria," she said without turning around, her eyes scanning the instrument panel and quickly assessing their situation, "I need you to contact air traffic control immediately and declare a medical emergency. Tell them we have an incapacitated flight crew and that a student pilot is taking control of the aircraft." As Maria reached for the radio, Sophia began the most important flight of her life, one that would either end in triumph or disaster, with no middle ground possible at 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. The path that led Sophia Chen to Seat 2A of Flight 447 had been paved with disappointment, family pressure, and a dream that seemed perpetually out of reach. Born to Dr. James Chen, a senior aeronautical engineer at Boeing, and Dr. Lisa Chen, a NASA aerospace researcher, Sophia had grown up surrounded by aviation excellence and the expectation that she would naturally excel in anything related to flight. The reality had proven far more complicated and painful than anyone in her family had anticipated. From the age of 5, Sophia had been building model aircraft with her father in their garage workshop, learning the principles of lift, thrust, drag, and weight before she could properly tie her shoes. By 10, she could identify any commercial aircraft by its silhouette and recite the specifications of dozens of different models from memory. Her parents had assumed that her obvious passion for aviation and her exceptional academic performance would translate seamlessly into piloting success. The Chen family had immigrated from Taiwan when Sophia was 2 years old, carrying with them the intense academic pressure and perfectionist expectations that had driven both parents to the top of their respective fields. Dr. James Chen had worked on the design teams for the 787 Dreamliner and the 777X, while Dr. Lisa Chen had contributed to guidance systems for multiple NASA missions. Success wasn't just expected in the Chen household, it was considered inevitable. Sophia's first flight lesson at age 16 had been a disaster that should have warned everyone involved about the challenges ahead. Despite knowing more about aircraft systems than many certified pilots, she had frozen at the controls during a simple pattern exercise, unable to make the split-second decisions that flying demanded. Her instructor had attributed it to first flight nerves, but the pattern had continued through dozens of subsequent lessons. The problem wasn't knowledge or skill. Sophia consistently scored at the top of her class on written examinations and could troubleshoot complex aircraft systems problems that stumped other students. Her understanding of aerodynamics, navigation, weather patterns, and emergency procedures was virtually encyclopedic. But when it came to actually flying the aircraft, especially under pressure, something in her mind would shut down, leaving her unable to translate her extensive theoretical knowledge into practical action. Her first attempt at the private pilot license examination had ended in humiliation when she failed to properly execute a standard emergency landing procedure during the practical test. The examiner's comments had been particularly stinging. "Candidate demonstrates exceptional theoretical knowledge but lacks the confidence and decision-making ability required for safe piloting operations." The second attempt 6 months later had gone even worse, with Sophia actually freezing at the controls during a simulated engine failure requiring the examiner to take control of the aircraft. The failures had devastated not just Sophia but her entire family. Dr. James Chen couldn't understand how his daughter, who had absorbed aviation knowledge like a sponge since childhood, could be unable to pass what he considered basic competency tests. Dr. Lisa Chen had suggested that perhaps Sophia should consider a different career path, one that would better suit her obvious academic abilities without the pressure of real-time decision-making that piloting required. The family dynamics had become increasingly strained as Sophia's failures mounted. Her younger brother Kevin, now a freshman at MIT studying aerospace engineering, seemed to effortlessly excel at everything he attempted, making Sophia's struggles even more painful by comparison. Family gatherings had become awkward affairs where relatives would ask about her flying progress, forcing Sophia to deflect questions about her obvious inability to live up to the Chen family's legacy of aviation achievement. After her second failed examination, Sophia had made the painful decision to withdraw from flight school and pursue a safer path. Her parents had reluctantly agreed to pay for her to complete a degree in aviation management at a prestigious university in London, reasoning that at least she could still work in the industry even if she couldn't pilot aircraft. The trip to London was supposed to be her opportunity to explain her decision in person and begin the process of redirecting her life toward more realistic goals. But during her years of struggling with flight training, Sophia had developed an unexpected expertise in crisis management and emergency procedures. Her instructors had noticed that while she failed under the pressure of routine examinations, she showed remarkable composure when dealing with theoretical emergency scenarios. Her written papers on emergency protocols and crisis decision-making had been published in several student aviation journals, and she had won awards for her analysis of famous aviation accidents and the factors that had contributed to successful emergency landings. Unknown to anyone, including herself, Sophia had been unconsciously preparing for exactly the kind of situation that Flight 447 now presented. Her failures in controlled testing environments had taught her to function despite overwhelming pressure, while her encyclopedic knowledge of aircraft systems gave her resources that most pilots never acquired. The combination of extensive theoretical preparation and hard-earned experience with failure had created someone uniquely qualified to handle an impossible situation. As she sat in the cockpit of the Boeing 777, surrounded by instruments and controls that she understood better than most certified pilots, Sophia realized that everything that had seemed like failure in her life had actually been preparation for this moment. Her inability to pass standard examinations had forced her to study emergency procedures far more thoroughly than required. Her family's disappointment had taught her to function under intense emotional pressure. Her repeated failures had eliminated her fear of making mistakes, leaving her free to focus on solutions rather than worrying about consequences. The irony was almost overwhelming. The girl who had been deemed unfit to pilot aircraft was now the only person on Flight 447 capable of bringing 180 souls safely home. Every moment of doubt, every failed examination, every disappointed look from her parents had led to this point where theoretical knowledge and hard-earned resilience would either save everyone aboard or become a shared tragedy that no one would survive to remember. But as Sophia's hands moved across the instrument panel with surprising confidence, she felt something she had never experienced during her training flights, the absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. The first 15 minutes after Sophia took control of Flight 447 revealed the true scope of the crisis facing everyone aboard the aircraft. What had initially appeared to be a medical emergency affecting the flight crew was rapidly evolving into a cascade of system failures that would have challenged even the most experienced pilots in aviation history. As Sophia worked through the emergency checklists while Maria coordinated with air traffic control, the full complexity of their situation began to emerge. Transatlantic 447, this is Gander Control, the voice crackled through the radio with professional concern. We show you significantly off course and requesting priority handling. Please confirm the nature of your emergency and your current flight crew status. Maria looked to Sophia, who was simultaneously monitoring the autopilot systems and trying to assess the condition of the unconscious pilots. Captain Rodriguez remained completely unresponsive, while First Officer Park was drifting in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling incoherently before slipping back into what appeared to be a medically induced stupor. Gander Control, Transatlantic 447, Sophia responded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. We have both pilots incapacitated by unknown medical emergency. I am Sophia Chen, unlicensed student pilot with extensive systems training currently assuming aircraft control. We have 180 souls on board and are requesting immediate assistance and emergency landing clearance. The silence that followed her transmission seemed to last forever, though it was probably only seconds before the controller responded. Transatlantic 447, understand you have student pilot in control. Please confirm your flight training background and current aircraft status. Sophia quickly ran through her qualifications while scanning the instrument panel for anomalies. Gander Control, I have approximately 200 hours of flight training on similar aircraft, extensive knowledge of Boeing 777 systems, but I am not certified for commercial operations. Aircraft appear stable on autopilot, but we're showing multiple system warnings that I'm still assessing. As she spoke, more warning lights began illuminating across the instrument panel. The hydraulic pressure indicators were showing fluctuations in 2 of the 3 independent systems, while the electrical load distribution panel was indicating power irregularities that didn't match normal flight operations. Most concerning of all, the cabin pressure system was beginning to show signs of instability that could potentially affect the consciousness of everyone aboard. Maria, Sophia said quietly, I need you to check on the other flight attendants and see if anyone else is showing signs of medical distress. Also, we need to get these pilots some medical attention if possible. Something is affecting their consciousness, and we need to understand what we're dealing with. The lead flight attendant nodded and quickly left the cockpit, leaving Sophia alone with the 2 unconscious pilots and the increasingly complex array of system warnings. As she worked through the emergency procedures she had memorized but never expected to use, a troubling pattern began to emerge. The cabin air filtration system was showing anomalous readings that suggested possible contamination in the air supply. The pilot's symptoms, combined with the system irregularities, pointed toward a potential carbon monoxide leak or other airborne toxin that was affecting the flight crew's ability to maintain consciousness. If Sophia's analysis was correct, then everyone aboard Flight 447 might be at risk of succumbing to the same condition that had incapacitated the pilots. Gander Control, Transatlantic 447, she transmitted urgently, I'm seeing indications of possible cabin air contamination. Requesting immediate clearance to descend to 10,000 feet and guidance to nearest suitable airport for emergency landing. We may have limited time before additional crew members are affected. Transatlantic 447 cleared for immediate descent to flight level 100. Turn right heading 090 degrees for direct routing to St. John's International. Emergency services are being alerted. Be advised that we're coordinating with airline operations to get qualified pilot assistance via radio communication. Sophia disconnected the autopilot and took manual control of the aircraft for the first time in her life outside of a training environment. The Boeing 777 responded to her inputs exactly as the simulators had predicted, but the reality of controlling an aircraft weighing over 300 tons with 179 other people depending on her decisions was overwhelming in ways that no training could have prepared her for. As the aircraft began its descent, she noticed that First Officer Park was showing signs of improved consciousness at the lower altitude. The pilot's eyes were opening more frequently, and she seemed to be attempting to speak, though her words were still slurred and incoherent. Lisa, Sophia said to the barely conscious first officer, can you hear me? We need your help. Something in the cabin air has been affecting you and the captain. I'm a student pilot and I'm trying to get us safely on the ground. First Officer Park's eyes focused on Sophia with obvious difficulty, and she managed to whisper something that sounded like oxygen masks before losing consciousness again. The comment triggered a realization that made Sophia's blood run cold. If the cabin air was contaminated, then the emergency oxygen system might be their only protection against whatever had affected the flight crew.
She quickly activated the passenger oxygen system, causing masks to drop throughout the cabin. The action would undoubtedly cause panic among the passengers, but it might also prevent them from succumbing to the same condition that had incapacitated the pilots. Over the intercom, she could hear Maria explaining the situation to increasingly anxious passengers while trying to maintain some semblance of order. As Flight 447 continued its emergency descent through the storm clouds, Sophia realized that they were racing against time in ways she hadn't initially understood. Not only did she need to successfully land an aircraft that she wasn't qualified to fly, but she needed to do it before whatever was in the cabin air affected her own ability to function. The nearest airport was still over an hour away, and the weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The storm system that had seemed manageable at cruising altitude was proving to be a significant obstacle at lower flight levels, with turbulence that tested Sophia's ability to maintain control of the aircraft while simultaneously managing the multiple emergencies they were facing. But as challenging as the external conditions were, Sophia was beginning to realize that the greatest danger might be time itself, and whether she could remain conscious long enough to bring everyone safely home.
The descent through the storm system tested every aspect of Sophia's limited flying experience and pushed the Boeing 777 to the edge of its operational envelope. As Flight 447 dropped through 20,000 feet, the aircraft encountered turbulence severe enough to send unsecured objects flying through the cabin and challenge Sophia's ability to maintain controlled flight. The weather radar painted an ominous picture of rotating supercells and wind shear conditions that would have caused experienced pilots to request significant course deviations. Transatlantic 447, Gander Control, the radio crackled through another burst of static. Be advised that weather conditions at St. John's are deteriorating rapidly. We're showing wind shear alerts and gusts up to 60 knots. Halifax International has better conditions if you feel capable of the additional flight time. Sophia studied the fuel gauges while fighting to keep the aircraft level through another bout of severe turbulence. The Boeing 777 had been about halfway through its transatlantic crossing when the emergency began, leaving them with fuel reserves that would normally be considered adequate but were becoming increasingly critical given the circumstances. Gander Control, request fuel calculations for Halifax routing, she responded while simultaneously trying to interpret the engine management system displays that were showing power fluctuations related to the rough air. Also requesting immediate radio contact with Boeing or airline operations for technical assistance. The request for technical support had been weighing on her mind since taking control of the aircraft. While her theoretical knowledge of the 777 systems was extensive, she had never dealt with the kind of complex emergency scenarios that the aircraft was now presenting. The combination of medical emergency, possible air contamination, severe weather, and system irregularities represented a convergence of problems that would challenge even the most experienced flight crews. As the aircraft continued its descent, First Officer Park began showing signs of improved consciousness. The combination of lower altitude and the emergency oxygen supply seemed to be counteracting whatever had caused her initial incapacitation. Her eyes were staying open longer, and she was beginning to respond to direct questions, though her speech remained slurred and her movements uncoordinated. "Lisa," Sophia said during a brief lull in the turbulence, "I need you to help me understand what happened. Do you remember anything about the onset of symptoms? Any unusual odors or system warnings before you lost consciousness?" The first officer struggled to focus her attention, clearly fighting the effects of whatever had affected her cognitive function. "Electrical. Burning smell," she managed to whisper. "Captain said, check air conditioning." Then everything went. Her voice trailed off as she lost consciousness again. The partial information was enough to confirm Sophia's suspicions about air contamination, but it also raised new concerns about potential electrical fire or system failure that could be causing the cabin air problems. She quickly reviewed the electrical system status displays, looking for any indications of overheating or component failure that might explain the pilot's symptoms. What she found was troubling. The main air conditioning pack was showing temperature readings slightly above normal parameters, while the electrical load distribution panel indicated that several non-essential systems were drawing more power than specified. The pattern suggested a developing electrical problem that could potentially affect other critical systems if not addressed. Gander Control, Transatlantic 447, she transmitted urgently. We may have electrical system irregularities contributing to our air contamination problem. Requesting immediate patch to airline maintenance for technical guidance on system isolation procedures. Transatlantic 447, stand by for maintenance frequency coordination. Also be advised that Captain Williams, retired transatlantic Czech airman, is standing by on emergency frequency 121.9 to provide flying assistance if needed. The prospect of having an experienced pilot available for radio guidance was enormously reassuring, but Sophia knew that ultimately she would be the one making the critical decisions and executing the landing. No amount of radio assistance could substitute for hands-on experience with the aircraft controls, especially in the challenging conditions they were likely to encounter. As Flight 447 passed through 15,000 feet, the turbulence began to moderate slightly, but the weather ahead remained threatening. Lightning was visible in multiple directions, and the aircraft's weather radar was painting a complex picture of precipitation cores and wind shear zones that would require careful navigation to avoid. Maria returned to the cockpit with an update on the passenger situation that added another layer of complexity to their emergency. 3 passengers in coach are showing signs of nausea and disorientation, she reported. The oxygen masks seem to be helping, but we have people who are getting very frightened. They want to know if we're going to make it. The question hung in the air between them, highlighting the weight of responsibility that Sophia was carrying. Every decision she made would affect not just her own survival but the lives of 179 other people who had trusted their safety to the awesome professional crew. The irony that their lives now depended on someone who had been deemed unqualified to pilot was not lost on anyone involved. Tell them that we're in communication with air traffic control and have experienced pilot assistance available by radio, Sophia said. We're making an emergency landing at the new suitable airport, and we have every reason to expect a successful outcome. The confidence in her voice surprised even herself, but as she spoke the words, she realized that they were true. Despite the multiple challenges they were facing, the aircraft was responding normally to her control inputs, the emergency procedures were working as designed, and her extensive theoretical knowledge was proving adequate to manage the complex situation. But as the aircraft continued its descent toward the storm-lashed coast of Newfoundland, Sophia knew that the most difficult part of their ordeal was still ahead. Landing a commercial aircraft in severe weather conditions would test skills that she had never fully developed and push her beyond anything she had experienced in training. The next hour would determine whether Flight 447 became another tragic aviation accident or one of the most remarkable emergency landings in commercial. 12,000 feet above the North Atlantic was St. John's International Airport, still 40 minutes away. Sophia Chen faced a crisis that went beyond anything her aviation training had prepared her for. The Boeing 777's multiple system warnings had continued to escalate, painting a picture of cascading failures that would challenge even the most experienced flight crews. But more than the technical challenges, she was grappling with the psychological pressure of being responsible for 179 lives while battling her own history of failure under pressure. Transatlantic 447, this is Captain Williams on The radio crackled with the voice of the retired airline pilot who had volunteered to provide assistance. I understand you're a student pilot dealing with multiple emergencies. First, I want you to know that you're doing everything right so far. Can you give me a detailed status report on aircraft systems and current conditions? The reassurance in Captain Williams' voice provided Sophia with the first moment of genuine confidence she had felt since taking control of the aircraft. As she ran through the system's status, she realized that her extensive theoretical knowledge was proving more valuable than she had ever imagined during her failed certification attempts. Captain Williams, we have partial electrical irregularities affecting the main air conditioning pack, possible cabin air contamination that incapacitated both pilots, hydraulic pressure fluctuations in systems A and B, and we're flying through severe weather with multiple wind shear alerts ahead, she reported with professional clarity that surprised even herself. Copy all 447. You're dealing with what we call a compound emergency, multiple unrelated failures that create unique challenges. The good news is that the 777 is designed to handle exactly these kinds of scenarios. I'm going to talk you through some system isolations that should address your airworthy issues. As Captain Williams guided her through the emergency procedures for isolating the faulty air conditioning pack, Sophia found herself accessing knowledge that she had absorbed during countless hours of study but never expected to use. The irony was striking. Her failure to pass routine flight examinations had driven her to study emergency procedures far more thoroughly than most pilots ever did. First Officer Park was showing continued improvement at the lower altitude, and with the emergency oxygen supply, she was now conscious for longer periods and beginning to provide coherent assistance with systems management, though her coordination remained impaired by whatever toxin had affected her. Sophia Lisa managed to say during one of her lucid periods, "You're doing great. I can help with radio work and checklists. Don't try to do everything yourself." The support from the professional pilot was enormously meaningful, but Sophia knew that the critical flying decisions would ultimately be hers alone. As they approached the outer edges of the storm system surrounding St. John's, she could see the full scope of the weather challenges ahead. "Gander Control Transatlantic 447," she transmitted. "We're showing severe weather at St. John's with wind shear alerts, requesting current approach conditions and available runway options." Transatlantic 447, St. John's is reporting winds 280 degrees at 35 knots, gusting to 52 knots. Visibility 2 miles and heavy rain, ceiling 800 feet. Runway 1129 is available with ILS approach. Be advised that conditions are at the edge of operational limits for your type. The weather report confirmed Sophia's worst fears about the approach conditions. Landing in such severe crosswinds would challenge her limited flying skills to their absolute breaking point, while the low visibility would make it difficult to visually acquire the runway even if she managed to execute the instrument approach correctly. Captain Williams' voice came back on the emergency frequency with guidance that addressed her concerns directly. 447, I know those conditions sound intimidating, but the 777 can handle much worse than what you're facing. The key is going to be maintaining approach speed precisely and being ready to execute a go-around if the approach becomes unstable. Captain Williams, I need to be honest with you, Sophia said, her voice carrying a vulnerability that she had never allowed herself to show during training. I've never successfully completed a crosswind landing in training conditions, much less in weather like this. I failed my certification exams twice because I couldn't make the right decisions under pressure. The admission hung in the air for a moment before Captain Williams responded with unexpected warmth. Sophia, every pilot I know has failed at something during training. But you're not in training anymore. You're in command of an aircraft with people depending on you, and that changes everything. The fact that you're managing this so well tells me that you have exactly the skills needed to bring everyone home safely. As Flight 447 began its approach into the storm system, Sophia felt something shift in her mindset that had never happened during her training flights. The fear of failure that had paralyzed her during examinations was being overwhelmed by the immediate need to succeed. There was no examiner judging her performance, no grade to be assigned, only the simple necessity of getting the air. The weather radar showed the worst of the storm system directly over St. John's, with embedded thunderstorms and rotation signatures that indicated severe turbulence ahead. Lightning was visible in all directions, and the aircraft began encountering moderate turbulence as they entered the outer edges of the weather system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sophia in the cockpit," she announced over the passenger address system, her voice steady and reassuring despite the challenging conditions. "We're beginning our approach to St. John's International Airport. The weather is rough, but the aircraft is performing normally, and we expect to be on the ground safely within the next 20 minutes. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and remain calm." As she disconnected the autopilot and took manual control for the approach, Sophia realized that everything in her life had led to this moment. Her failures during training had taught her to function despite overwhelming pressure. Her extensive study of Concentration had given her knowledge that most pilots never acquired. Her fear of disappointing her family had been replaced by the simple determination to protect the people who were depending on her. The approach into St. John's would test every aspect of her flying ability, but for the first time in her aviation career, Sophia felt genuinely confident in her ability to succeed. The instrument approach to St. John's International Airport took Flight 447 directly through the heart of the storm system, subjecting the air and its 180 occupants to turbulence so severe that even the Boeing 777's advanced flight control system struggled to maintain stable flight. As Sophia fought to keep the air with flying progress after rain on reserves of skill and determination that she had never known she possessed. Transatlantic 447, St. John's Tower, the radio crackled through bursts of static generated by the electrical storm surrounding them. You're cleared for ILS approach runway 11. Be advised that winds are now 290 degrees at 42 knots gusting to 58 knots. Recommend you consider holding pattern for weather improvement if conditions become unmanageable. Sophia checked the fuel gauges again, confirming what she already knew. They had enough fuel for perhaps one approach attempt and a short hold, but not enough for extended weather delays or multiple landing attempts. If she couldn't get the aircraft on the ground at St. John's, their options would become extremely limited with potentially catastrophic consequences. Captain Williams, this is 447, she transmitted on the emergency. I'm beginning the approach, but these crosswinds are beyond anything I've ever trained for. I need guidance on crosswind landing techniques for the Sophia. The key to crosswind landings is maintaining precise airspeed control and being ready to apply significant rudder input to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway center line. Don't fight the aircraft's natural tendency to weathercock into the wind. Use it to maintain runway alignment and be prepared for firm control inputs during the flare. The approach began smoothly enough, with the aircraft tracking the instrument landing system signals toward the runway hidden somewhere in the storm ahead. But as they descended through 5,000 feet, the weather conditions began to deteriorate beyond anything Sophia had imagined possible. Wind shear alerts began sounding in the cockpit as the aircraft encountered rapid changes in wind direction and velocity that threatened to push them off the approach path. Lightning strikes illuminated the clouds around them in brilliant flashes that momentarily blinded her night vision, while the radar altimeter showed terrain features that seemed uncomfortably close to their flight path. Terrain, pull up, the aircraft's ground proximity warning system announced in its calm electronic voice, indicating that they were approaching minimum safe altitudes for the mountainous terrain surrounding St. John's Airport. Sophia adjusted their descent rate while fighting to maintain the precise approach path that would bring them safely to the runway. First Officer Park was now conscious and attempting to help with the approach checklist. Landing gear down, she managed to announce as Sophia selected the gear lever, adding the drag and stability that would help them maintain approach speed in the turbulent conditions. At 2,000 feet above the airport, the aircraft encountered the worst turbulence of the entire flight. The Boeing 777 was lifted and dropped by wind currents that subjected everyone aboard to forces approaching the limits of the aircraft's structural design. Overhead bins began opening despite their latches, and the sound of passengers crying and praying was audible even in the cockpit over the noise of the storm. Glide slope alive, First Officer Park announced weakly, indicating that they were now receiving vertical guidance signals from the runway's instrument landing system. But as Sophia attempted to follow the electronic glide path, the aircraft was being pushed off course by crosswinds that seemed to change direction and intensity every few seconds. St. John's Tower, Transatlantic 447, she transmitted with growing concern. We're encountering severe wind shear and are having difficulty maintaining approach path. Requesting current wind conditions and any available weather updates. Transatlantic 447,
Winds are now variable 250 to 310 degrees at 45 knots, gusting to 65 knots with embedded wind shear. The tower controller responded. Emergency equipment is standing by. You're cleared to land any runway if you can maintain approach stability. The wind conditions were now officially beyond the Boeing 777's certified operational limits, entering territory where even test pilots would consider discontinuing the approach. But with fuel running low and no viable alternatives, Sophia knew that they were committed to landing regardless of the conditions. At 1,000 feet above the airport, she finally caught sight of the approach lights through the rain and clouds. The runway was visible as a narrow strip of lights in the distance, but it appeared to be moving back and forth as the aircraft was buffeted by the crosswinds. The visual confirmation of their target gave her renewed confidence, but it also highlighted the extreme difficulty of the landing they were attempting. Decision height. First Officer Park announced as they reached the minimum altitude for continuing the approach. Below this point, they would be committed to landing regardless of conditions. Sophia could see the runway clearly now, but the aircraft was being pushed significantly off the center line by the crosswinds. Continuing approach, she announced, applying rudder to align the aircraft with the runway while using opposite aileron to prevent drifting sideways. The technique required precise coordination that she had never successfully demonstrated during training, but somehow her hands seemed to know what to do without conscious thought. The ground was rushing up toward them now, and Sophia could see emergency vehicles positioned along the runway with their lights flashing. The sight of the rescue equipment waiting for them was both reassuring and terrifying, evidence that everyone understood the gravity of what they were attempting. 50 feet. First Officer Park called out as they crossed the runway threshold. 40, 30, 20. Sophia began the flare that would transition them from approach to landing, pulling back gently on the controls while fighting to maintain runway alignment in the fierce crosswind. This was the moment that would determine whether Flight 447 ended in triumph or tragedy.
The final moments of Flight 447's approach unfolded in a blur of wind, rain, and split-second decisions that would determine the fate of everyone aboard. As Sophia pulled back on the controls to flare for landing, the Boeing 777 was caught by a sudden wind gust that pushed them sideways across the runway center line, threatening to send them off the pavement entirely. Fighting against every instinct that screamed at her to abandon the landing attempt, she applied full rudder and opposite aileron in a desperate effort to realign the aircraft with the runway. 20 feet, 15, 10. First Officer Park's voice counted down their altitude as the main landing gear approached the runway surface. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, Sophia could see they were still significantly off center line, but there was no time or altitude left to make major corrections. The main gear touched down with a violent impact that sent shockwaves through the entire aircraft structure, followed immediately by the nose gear slamming onto the pavement as the crosswind tried to weathercock the aircraft into the wind. Sophia's hands moved instinctively to deploy the speed brakes and thrust reversers, drawing on muscle memory from countless simulator sessions that she had never expected to use in real life. Reverse thrust set, speed brakes deployed, she announced while fighting to maintain directional control of the aircraft as it decelerated through the crosswind. The Boeing 777 was tracking toward the left edge of the runway, requiring constant rudder inputs to keep them on the pavement as their speed decreased. But as the aircraft slowed through 60 knots, a new crisis emerged that threatened to transform their successful landing into a disaster. The left main landing gear, damaged by the hard touchdown in the crosswind, began to fail catastrophically. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel as the gear strut collapsed, sending the left wing tip toward the runway surface. Gear collapse, left main. First Officer Park shouted as the aircraft began to veer uncontrollably toward the left side of the runway. The failure of the landing gear created a situation that no amount of pilot training could fully prepare someone to handle: a massive commercial sliding sideways on a wet runway with 180 people aboard. Sophia's reaction was purely instinctual, applying differential braking and rudder to prevent the aircraft from leaving the runway entirely while trying to maintain some semblance of directional control. The Boeing 777 slid sideways across the wet pavement, its left wing tip beginning to scrape against the runway surface in a shower of sparks that illuminated the storm around them. "Mayday, Mayday, St. John's Tower," she transmitted while fighting the controls. Transatlantic 447 has experienced landing gear failure on rollout. "We're sliding off runway centerline but still on pavement. Emergency evacuation may be required." The aircraft continued its uncontrolled slide for what seemed like an eternity but was probably less than 30 seconds before finally coming to rest approximately 200 feet from the runway centerline, tilted at an extreme angle with the left wing tip touching the ground. Emergency vehicles were already racing toward them, their flashing lights visible through the storm as rescue teams prepared for the worst-case scenario. "Engine shutdown checklist," Sophia called out, her voice remarkably steady considering the circumstances they were facing. First Officer Park, now fully conscious and functioning despite her earlier incapacitation, began working through the emergency procedures to secure the aircraft systems and prepare for evacuation. In the cabin, Maria and the other flight attendants were already preparing passengers for emergency evacuation, though the aircraft's tilted attitude and the storm conditions outside would make the process extremely challenging. The sound of passengers crying and calling out to loved ones filled the aircraft as everyone realized how close they had come to a potentially catastrophic accident. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sophia in the cockpit," she announced over the passenger address system. "We have landed safely at St. John's International Airport, but we've experienced a landing gear failure that requires emergency evacuation. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of your flight attendants. Emergency personnel are already on scene to assist us." Through the cockpit windows, she could see emergency vehicles surrounding the aircraft as rescue teams assessed the situation and prepared to begin passenger evacuation. The storm was still raging around them, but they were on the ground and alive, an outcome that had seemed doubtful just minutes earlier. Captain Williams' voice came through the emergency frequency with obvious relief and professional admiration. "Transatlantic 447, that was outstanding airmanship under impossible conditions. You got everyone on the ground alive, and that's what matters. Emergency teams are taking over now. You've done your job." The words carried a weight of professional recognition that meant more to Sophia than any certification or examination grade ever could. She had successfully landed a commercial aircraft under conditions that would have challenged the most experienced pilots, bringing 180 people safely home despite multiple system failures and weather conditions that exceeded operational limits. But as she began shutting down the aircraft systems and preparing to evacuate, Sophia realized that this was just the beginning of the story. The successful landing of Flight 446 would be investigated, analyzed and studied for years to come. More importantly, it would fundamentally change her understanding of her own capabilities and her future in aviation. First Officer Park reached over and squeezed her shoulder with a grip that conveyed gratitude beyond words. "You saved us all," she said simply. "I don't know how you did it, but you saved us all." Looking out at the emergency vehicles and rescue personnel working in the storm to evacuate passengers, Sophia felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with certifications or examinations. She had faced the ultimate test of pilot skills and emerged successful, proving to herself and everyone else that her extensive knowledge and determination could overcome any limitation that others might try to impose. The girl who had been deemed unfit to fly had just completed one of the most remarkable emergency landings in commercial aviation history. But more than that, she had discovered that failure during training meant nothing compared to success when lives depended on her decisions. The emergency evacuation of Flight 447 took place in the middle of the worst storm to hit Newfoundland in over a decade, with rescue personnel working in near-hurricane conditions to safely remove 180 passengers and crew from the damaged aircraft. The Boeing 777's tilted attitude and the collapsed landing gear made normal evacuation procedures impossible, forcing emergency teams to improvise solutions while battling winds that threatened to knock them off their feet. Sophia remained in the cockpit coordinating with rescue personnel until every passenger had been safely evacuated, her voice steady over the radio as she provided critical information about the aircraft's condition and potential hazards. The fuel system had been secured and the electrical power shut down, but the aircraft's precarious position on the runway created ongoing safety concerns for the evacuation teams. Incident commander to cockpit crew, the radio crackled with the voice of the emergency response leader. We have successfully evacuated 178 passengers with only minor injuries reported. Outstanding job getting everyone down safely. We're ready to evacuate flight crew now. As Sophia and First Officer Park prepared to leave the aircraft that had become their shared responsibility for the most intense hours of their lives, they both paused to look around the cockpit that had witnessed their unlikely partnership. The instrument panel was dark now, the screens blank, but the memory of those final approach minutes would remain with them forever. I can't believe we actually pulled it off, Lisa said, her voice carrying exhaustion and amazement in equal measure. When I regained consciousness and saw a student pilot flying the approach, I thought we were all going to die, but you were incredible up here. The evacuation from the cockpit required assistance from rescue personnel due to the aircraft's tilted attitude, but within minutes, both pilots were safely on the ground and being escorted to the terminal building where passengers and crew were being evaluated by medical personnel. The storm was still raging around them, but the warmth and safety of the terminal felt like a different world after the intensity of the past few hours. The passenger terminal had been transformed into a makeshift triage center where medical teams evaluated everyone from Flight 447 for injuries and the effects of possible air contamination. Most passengers were uninjured except for minor bruises from the turbulence in landing, but several were being treated for respiratory irritation that confirmed Sophia's suspicions about cabin air quality problems. Maria Santos, the lead flight attendant, found Sophia in the medical evaluation area and embraced her with tears streaming down her face. "You saved my life," she said simply. "You saved all our lives. I've been flying for 15 years and I've never seen anything like what you did up there." Word of the successful emergency landing was already spreading beyond St. John's Airport, with news crews and aviation officials converging on Newfoundland to learn more about the unprecedented situation that had unfolded aboard Flight 447. The story of a failed pilot trainee successfully landing a commercial aircraft under extreme conditions was capturing worldwide attention. As the aviation community struggled to understand how such an unlikely outcome had been achieved, Dr. James and Dr. Lisa Chen arrived at St. John's on the first available flight from Seattle, their faces reflecting the complex emotions of parents whose daughter had gone from aviation failure to international hero in a single flight. The phone call informing them that Sophia had successfully landed Flight 447 had been almost impossible for them to believe, given her history of struggles with flight training. "We're so proud of you, Dr. James Chen said as he embraced his daughter in the terminal, his voice choking with emotion. "We never understood why you were having trouble with your training, but now we see that you were just waiting for the right moment to show what you could really do." The reunion with her parents represented more than just family relief, it was validation of capabilities that everyone, including Sophia herself, had begun to doubt. Her extensive theoretical knowledge and crisis management skills had proven to be exactly what was needed when real lives depended on quick thinking and decisive action. Captain Williams, the retired airline pilot who had provided radio assistance during the emergency, made the trip to St. John's specifically to meet the student pilot who had executed one of the most difficult emergency landings he had witnessed in 40 years of aviation. His professional assessment would carry significant weight in the investigation that would inevitably follow. "What you accomplished today challenges everything we think we know about pilot training and certification," he told Sophia during their meeting at the airport. "Your knowledge of aircraft systems and emergency procedures exceeded that of many certified airline pilots. The aviation industry needs to seriously examine whether our current training methods are identifying the right qualities in pilot candidates." The preliminary investigation into Flight 447's was already beginning, with teams from the National Transportation Safety Board, Transport Canada and Boeing arriving to examine the aircraft and interview crew members. The combination of electrical system failure, air contamination, severe weather and landing gear collapse represented a was for that space which Frazandis, but will provide valuable lessons for future emergency procedures. But beyond the technical investigation, the story of Flight 447 was raising fundamental questions about pilot selection, training methodology, and the relationship between academic knowledge and practical flying ability. Sophia's success despite her certification failures suggested that the industry might be overlooking qualified candidates whose skills didn't match traditional testing criteria. As the immediate crisis subsided and the adrenaline began to wear off, Sophia found herself reflecting on the transformation that had occurred during those crucial hours at the controls of Flight 447. The fear of failure that had paralyzed her during training flights had been replaced by the clarity of purpose that came from protecting other people's lives. The girl who had walked onto Flight 447 as a disappointed student abandoning her aviation dreams was leaving as a pilot whose capabilities had been proven under the most extreme conditions. The journey from failure to heroism had taken less than 4 hours, but it would change the direction of her life forever. The investigation into Flight 447's emergency landing became one of the most comprehensive aviation accident studies in recent history, not because of the outcome, but because of the unprecedented circumstances that had led to a student pilot successfully completing a aircraft emergency landing under extreme conditions. Teams from multiple aviation authorities spent weeks examining from the electrical system failure that had contaminated the cabin air to the decision-making process that had enabled Sophia to overcome her training limitations when lives depended on her action. The technical findings confirmed Sophia's initial assessment of the a series of electrical system failures had caused overheating in the main air conditioning pack, releasing trace amounts of toxic compounds into the cabin air supply that had gradually overcome the flight crew's cognitive abilities. The concentration levels were not immediately life-threatening, but they were sufficient to cause progressive impairment of judgment and motor functions, a condition that would have eventually affected everyone aboard if not addressed. The student pilot's recognition of the air contamination problem and her immediate response with emergency oxygen and descent procedures prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of consciousness among all crew members. Read the preliminary report from the National Transportation Safety Board. Her extensive knowledge of aircraft systems and was 40, but the technical aspects of the investigation, while important for future safety improvements, were overshadowed by human factors analysis that examined how someone who had failed commercial pilot certification twice could successfully handle an emergency that would have challenged the most experienced airline captains. The findings would fundamentally change how the aviation industry thought about pilot selection and training. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the lead human factors investigator, spent hours interviewing Sophia about her thought processes during the emergency, trying to understand how her mindset had changed when confronted with real-world conditions versus controlled training environments. The insights would prove valuable for improving pilot education programs worldwide. During training flights, I was always worried about making mistakes and disappointing my instructors, Sophia explained during one of the interviews. But during the emergency, there was no time to worry about failure. I could only focus on solving the immediate problems and the fear of failure that paralyzed me during testing disappeared when other people's lives depended on my decision. The distinction between performance under artificial testing conditions versus real-world emergency situations became a central theme of the investigation's findings. Sophia's extensive theoretical knowledge and her crisis management skills developed through years of studying emergency procedures to compensate for her practical flying difficulties had proven more valuable than traditional stick-and-rudder abilities when facing unprecedented challenges. Captain Williams, who had provided radio assistance during the emergency,
testified before the investigation panel about the quality of Sophia's decision-making and her professional handling of multiple simultaneous crises.
His assessment carried significant weight due to his reputation as one of the industry's most respected training captains. In 40 years of commercial aviation, I have rarely seen better crew resource management or crisis decision-making than what Ms. Chen demonstrated during Flight 447's emergency, he stated in his formal testimony. Her systematic approach to problem-solving and her comprehensive knowledge of aircraft systems exceeded the capability of many pilots with thousands of hours of experience. The investigation's findings led to immediate changes in pilot training programs and several major Emirates' emphasis on systems knowledge
and emergency decision-making, rather than relying solely on traditional flight proficiency measures.
Sophia's case study became required
reading at flight training academies worldwide, as educators recognized the need to identify and develop different types of aviation talent.
3 months after the emergency landing, Sophia received a call from Transatlantic Airways chief pilot offering her a position in their pilot training program, specifically designed to develop her exceptional systems knowledge and crisis management abilities. The offer represented a complete reversal of the aviation industry's previous
assessment of her capabilities.
"We're not just offering you a job," Captain Rodriguez explained during their meeting
at the airline's headquarters.
"We want you to help us redesign our training programs to
develop pilots with your unique combination of theoretical knowledge and crisis leadership abilities.
The industry needs to change how we think about what makes an effective pilot." The recognition extended beyond the commercial
aviation industry, with Sophia receiving awards from pilot organizations, safety foundations, and aviation academies for her role in demonstrating that pilot capabilities couldn't be measured solely through traditional testing methods.
Her story became
a case study in human factors courses and a motivation for student pilots who struggled with conventional training approaches.
The Boeing company conducted its own analysis of Flight 447's emergency, focusing on how well their
participants had performed under the extreme conditions, and how effectively a minimally trained pilot had been able to utilize the 777's automated systems and emergency procedures.
Their findings led to improvements in pilot training materials
and aircraft interface design.
But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the 179 passengers and crew members whose lives had been saved by Sophia's actions during
those crucial hours over the North Atlantic.
Many maintained contact with her following the emergency, creating lasting relationships forged by their shared experience
of survival against overwhelming odds.
The annual reunion of Flight 447 passengers became a tradition, bringing together people from around the world who understood that they owed their lives to a young woman who had been deemed unqualified to pilot
aircraft by conventional standards.
Their stories of how the emergency had changed their own lives provided perspective on the broader
impact of that stormy night over Newfoundland.
As Sophia prepared to
begin her new career with Transatlantic Airways, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a failed student pilot into someone whose actions would influence aviation training for generations to come.
The fear of failure that had once paralyzed her had been replaced by confidence earned through the ultimate test of pilot skills. The girl who had boarded Flight 447 planning to abandon her aviation
dreams was now embarking on a career that would help reshape how the industry identified and developed pilot talent for the challenges of the future.
5 years after the emergency landing
of Flight 447,
Captain
Sophia Chen stood in the Flight Training Center at Transatlantic Airways headquarters, watching a new class of pilot candidates work through crisis simulation scenarios that had been developed based on her own experience over the North Atlantic.
The training programs she had helped design
were revolutionizing how the aviation industry identified and developed pilot talent, moving beyond traditional flying skills to emphasize systems knowledge, crisis decision-making, and the kind of comprehensive understanding that had enabled her unlikely success.
The Flight Training Center bore her name,
the Sophia Chen Center for Advanced Pilot Development, a recognition that still felt surreal to someone who had once been told she wasn't qualified to pilot aircraft.
But the center represented more than personal recognition.
It embodied a fundamental shift in how the aviation industry understood the relationship between knowledge, skill, and performance under pressure.
Captain Chen, the morning briefing is ready,
announced Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, the former Navy pilot who served as Sophia's Deputy Director of Training Programs.
The military precision she brought to civilian pilot education had proven invaluable in developing the structured yet flexible training
approaches that characterized the center's programs.
Sophia
smiled as she reviewed the training schedules and student assessment reports that showed the success of their unconventional approaches to pilot education.
Students who might have been eliminated under traditional training criteria
were excelling in the comprehensive programs that emphasized understanding over rote memorization, crisis management over routine procedures, and collaborative decision-making over individual performance metrics.
The Advanced Systems Integration course graduated another class yesterday,
Sarah reported with obvious satisfaction.
All 12 students passed their check rides on the first attempt,
including 3 who had previously struggled with traditional training methods at other schools.
The airlines are already requesting more graduates from our programs. The success of the training center had exceeded everyone's expectations, but it had also created demands that stretched their capacity to meet
the aviation industry's growing interest in their methods.
Airlines worldwide were sending their most promising candidates to study
at the center, while established pilots were requesting advanced training in the crisis management techniques that Sophia's experience had validated.
Through the observation windows,
Sophia could see students working in the high-fidelity simulators that recreated not just the technical challenges of aircraft emergencies, but the psychological pressures and decision-making demands that traditional training often ignored.
The simulators could generate the kind of complex
multi-system failures that Flight 447 had experienced, allowing students to develop skills that might never be needed, but could prove life-saving if circumstances demanded them.
Any word from the Flight 447 reunion planning committee? Sophia asked, referring to the annual gathering.
The bond had become increasingly important to her as a reminder of why her work mattered beyond academic achievement or professional recognition.
They're expecting over 100 attendees this year, sir, replied, including some new faces, family members of passengers who want to express their gratitude in person. Maria Santos is coordinating the logistics, and she wanted to confirm that you'll be delivering the keynote address about the new safety initiatives. The Flight 447 reunions had evolved from simple survivor gatherings into influential conferences that brought together passengers, crew members, aviation professionals, and safety experts to discuss lessons learned and ongoing improvements in emergency preparedness. The events had become forums for
aviation safety in ways that honored the shared experience of that stormy night over Newfoundland.
Captain Williams, now in his 70s but still actively
involved in aviation safety research, had become a regular speaker at the reunions, sharing insights about pilot training and emergency management that drew from decades of experience as well as the unique lessons of Flight 447.
His friendship with Sophia had
evolved into a mentoring relationship that bridged generational differences in aviation culture.
The morning news interview scheduled for 11 o'clock, Sarah continued,
referring to the media coverage that Sophia still found uncomfortable despite years of public recognition.
They want to discuss the impact of your training methods on commercial
aviation safety and the upcoming publication of your textbook on crisis decision-making.
The textbook, beyond certification developing complete
pilot capabilities, represented years of work distilling the lessons of Flight 447 into practical guidance for pilot education. Major airlines and flight schools worldwide had already adopted preliminary versions of the material, with measurable improvements in both training success rates and emergency response capabilities. But beyond the professional accomplishments and industry recognition, Sophia found her greatest satisfaction in the individual success stories of students who had overcome their own limitations through the training programs she had developed. Students who had been told they were pilot material were now flying commercially for major airlines, their careers enabled by education methods that recognize diverse forms of aviation talent. Captain Chen called out Michael Torres, one of the current advanced students who had been struggling with traditional training approaches before enrolling in the center's program. I wanted to thank you for believing in us non-traditional students. I just received confirmation that United Airlines wants to hire me for their pilot training program. The gratitude in Michael's voice reminded Sophia of her own journey from failure to success, and the importance of creating opportunities for pilots whose capabilities might not fit conventional patterns. The center's success in identifying and developing aviation talent had proven that the industry had been overlooking qualified candidates whose skills didn't match traditional testing criteria. As she walked through the training center's hallways lined with photographs from Flight 447 and testimonials from successful graduates, Sophia reflected on the unexpected direction her life had taken since that stormy night over the Atlantic. The girl who had boarded the aircraft planning to abandon her aviation dreams had become someone whose influence would shape pilot training for generations to come. The fear of failure that had once defined her relationship with aviation had been transformed into a passion for helping others overcome their own limitations and discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. Every successful graduate of the training center represented proof that conventional wisdom about pilot qualifications was incomplete, and that exceptional situations sometimes revealed exceptional people. Ready to change aviation again? Sarah asked with the warm humor that characterized their working relationship. Ready to help aviation change itself, Sophia replied, echoing the words she had spoken years earlier during those crucial hours of Flight 447. After all, human potential was never meant to be limited by the boundaries others try to impose. As they walked toward the briefing room where the next class of future pilots was waiting to begin their unconventional education, Sophia knew that the most important flight of her career wasn't behind her. It was in every student who would someday face their own impossible situation and discover they were capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.